Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, remember the TV show Better Call Saul? Well, some Ontario parents are thinking, if you want something done, better call Paul, as in Education Minister Paul Calandra. We'll tell you why.
It's been a snowy, cold, but meaningful Remembrance Week in the province as we remember those who, through the years, fought for our country.
We'll also have a follow-up on last week's fall economic statement with economist Brian Lewis from the U of T's Monk School to find out where those hits and misses are.
And in your column, my column, I'll be talking about a recent court case about cyclist safety in Ontario, but not the one you're thinking of.
And I'll have a last word on this province's 6 living former premiers, all of whom have been featured in a special TVO series called The Premier Files.
It's Friday, November 14th, 2025, so let's get to it.
JMM, our traditional sugar to start with.
Yes.
And then, what the hell are you wearing today? Now, for those who are listening as opposed to watching us, you probably should describe a bit about what is all over you.
Now, I have worn this shirt before on the podcast, so I apologize for the repeat, but it is a shirt festooned with the various Godzilla monsters and Godzilla-adjacent monsters of that film franchise.
But there's supposed to be something kind of, or at least my thinking, John Michael, is that there should be something kind of relevant to this week in what we choose to wear. What is relevant to this week about Godzilla and dragons?
Well, I saw something funny on the internet about Godzilla, and it made me laugh so much that I'm still laughing about it several days later. And it's sort of the perfect intersection of things about me that maybe our listeners could guess. But basically, it was, my wife forwarded me an Instagram post of something, and it's this picture of Godzilla stomping through Tokyo, and the caption was, "For Godzilla, all cities are walkable cities."
Okay, that's not bad.
I loved that so much, and it just gave me a giggle. And as I say, I'm still chuckling about. I'm a simple man, Steve. I have simple pleasures. I'm still laughing about this several days later, and I decided to honor that by wearing my Godzilla T-shirt today.
Fill your boots, baby. Works for me. That's okay. That's okay. I, on the other hand, decided to do something a little more traditional and consistent with the theme of the onpoli podcast.
Yes.
And also with the column I wrote this week. I mentioned in the intro, we're talking about former premiers in the column I wrote for the website, and I've got a former premier on today. And I know I've talked about this guy before, but I find him to be one of the most fascinating premiers in Ontario history. We've had 44 elections in the history of the province of Ontario, from 1867, Confederation, until the last one we had earlier this year. The Conservatives and the Liberals have won every single election except 2. You know one of them. You were alive for one of them.
Yes.
Bob Rae and the NDP in 1990. This guy, I'll stand up a little so you can see him here. Okay, that's Ernest Drury, who was the other non-liberal, non-conservative who won an election, and he won it on this date, November 14th, 1919. He was sworn in 106 years ago today. Our 8th premier, United Farmers of Ontario. Right? Not a Liberal, not a Tory, United Farmers of Ontario. I always find, one of the things that I find most fascinating about him is he didn't even run in the election in which he was sworn in as premier, right? The UFO won the most number of seats, but the party actually didn't have a leader. They were sort of a protest movement. They thought they'd throw some candidates in there. They ended up winning the most number of seats, and so they asked Ernest Drury to come out of retirement and become the leader again, which he did. He then had to run in a by-election the following year, in 1920, before he could assume his seat in the legislature. They only had, just like Bob Rae, only one term. He then ran federally for the farmers a few times in future federal elections, but never won. And until Bill Davis died a few years ago, he was our oldest living premier. He made it to age 90. No other premier made it to 90. Mr. Davis made it to 92. He died in 1968, so in my lifetime.
Wow. This
guy died. And for those of you who live in Milton, you may know the name. The E.C. Drury School for the Deaf is still in operation in Milton, Ontario. So I don't know. There's something about Drury that's always fascinated me. And here's a bit of a question for you, and this will prove that we don't set this up ahead of time. One other premier, actually in your lifetime, became Premier of Ontario without having a seat in the legislature. Drury was the first. Who was the next one?
Be Ernie Eves.
Good for you. Yes, well done. Ernie Eves won his convention in 2002. He was out of politics at the time, did not have a seat, so he became Premier without a seat. And he had to do what Drury did. Anyway, there we go.
You have twice referred to him as fascinating, one of the most fascinating previews. Knowing you, I have to ask, are you preparing to write a book about this?
No, and I'll tell you why. One's been done. There's a really good, thick book about Ernest Drury that's already been written. So, as I would say, my work here is done. Okay. I don't need to do it. And with that, shall we get down to business?
Let's do it.
Off to issue 1. Remember the TV show about the slimy lawyer Saul Goodman? It was called Better Call Saul. It was the prequel to Breaking Bad. Well, somebody at Queen's Park this week said there should be a new version called Better Call Paul, as in Paul Calandra, the education minister, who seems to have his fingers in numerous pies these days. Whether it's defenestrating school board trustees, signing childcare agreements, installing supervisors to take over school boards, or dealing with parents of autistic children, apparently, you better call Paul. JMM, what's the story?
So as you've indicated, there's a bunch of headlines from the last little while. So we're going to start with school trustees. As our listeners are probably aware, the minister has appointed supervisors for 5 Ontario school boards, including both Toronto school boards, the Catholic and public school boards. These supervisors have been tasked with rooting out misspending and inefficiency by these boards at the trustee level. This was prompted, of course, by a series of headlines, including the infamous sculpture hunting trip, I guess I would call it, to Italy by some trustees at a Catholic board. In that particular case, you mentioned defenestration. The minister went as far as to introduce legislation vacating the seat of one particular trustee who refused to repay the costs of that trip. That trustee recently resigned, so that legislation is now moot, but that just shows you just how far the government is willing to go in these cases.
And we never saw that before, did we? A bill brought in to deal with one trustee in one board somewhere in the province. I've never seen that before.
I've certainly never seen anything like that. I could not think of any kind of precedent for it.
Yeah.
Now, what we have since learned is that these supervisors are actually going to be able to bill the school boards. It's not the province paying for these funds directly, though, of course, the province does pay the lion's share of school budgets. The supervisors will be able to bill these school boards for not quite $400,000 per year as a maximum. That's $350,000 for their time and $20,000 in expenses. And we're looking at potentially 2 years of work that these supervisors are going to have to do. So a very large sum. And just to put this sum in context, perhaps, I mean, the total salary cost for all of the trustees in the Toronto Public School Board is a bit over $500,000. So this is a substantial chunk of change we're talking about.
And this is $400,000 for one guy.
For one supervisor.
Compared to $500,000 for the entire board.
Exactly.
Of trustees.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, ever since Mike Harris, trustees have been functionally a volunteer position. Those school boards do offer trustees honoraria. Now, of course, Minister Calandra says that he fully supports the supervisors in the important work that he says they are doing, and he will not be shocked if they bill the full amount that they are entitled to. But you and I have seen these stories before. When I first started reporting, I think the Catholic School Board in Toronto was just coming out of a period of supervision. And what happened in that case was that the cost of the supervisor and the investigation that had been done, those costs are actually substantially greater than the alleged scandal that justified the supervision in the first place, right? And there have been other stories like that over the years in Ontario where, the government steps in because of some headline-grabbing scandal, says, well, this will never stand. We have to do something. They appoint a supervisor, and then it turns out the supervisor was actually more expensive than the sums of money we were talking about. That may or may not happen again. In this case, it is obviously something that we are going to keep our eye on.
Yeah. We know there are some trustees who have made the argument that they are the oldest form of democratically elected government in Canadian history. They actually predate Confederation in 1867. And that if parents need somebody to complain to, who better than a democratically elected representative to take your concerns to? How sympathetic has Paul Calandra been to that argument?
Not hugely sympathetic. He has talked in the media about potentially getting rid of school board trustees entirely. And as you say, this would mark a pretty dramatic change, right? We've had elected school boards in Ontario longer than we've had a province of Ontario, longer than we've had an elected legislature, even before Confederation, longer than we've had elected municipal councils. The school board trustees were the first elected governments in this part of the world, if I could put it that way. So advocates for school board trustees and for students, particularly students with special needs, are raising the alarm bell about this, ringing the alarm bell, saying that, without that direct line to an elected school board trustee, they are functionally at the mercy of the bureaucracy in the school board system, right? Whether that's a principal or a other members of the educational staff, right? And this causes concerns, right? We mentioned this line about Better Call Saul. These advocates, Better Call Paul. See, these advocates are saying, functionally they're going to be put in a position where when anything goes wrong with their kids, who are they supposed to call? Well, if it's not school board trustees, sure, let's just call the minister. Let's make the minister the point of contact here, right? So, if it's your kid has been unfairly excluded from classroom activities, if it's, you have a child with autism and, they are, sent home from school, these kinds of things are the kind of interventions that, sometimes they are necessary in a school system, but the trustee is there to make sure that a student is being treated fairly. And if those trustees are gotten rid of, these parents are, I think, reasonably concerned about what is going to replace them as an accountability mechanism. We are also learning this week that these 5 school boards with supervisors have been told they have to create student and family support offices. The Toronto Star was the first to report this, that are going to be expected to deal with parental complaints within 5 days. Now, maybe that's just a temporary measure while they are under supervision, and the school board trustees have been totally, defenestrated, to use your word, or perhaps this is the
first
model
salvo
for what will come later in a more permanent way. Paul Calandra has talked about getting rid of the elected trustees in the English language public boards, because the rights of Catholic school boards are protected in the Constitution. The rights of French speaking students are protected by the Constitution. And so the place where it is easiest for the government to make the kind of reforms that he seems to be thinking about are in the English public language boards. But we still don't really have any kind of clarity about where the government. It could all just be a threat, right? It could just be a bluff to, from the government's perspective, to get school board trustees to smarten up.
And that sometimes works.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
This is part of politics, part of governing.
Yeah. Okay, that's education. Childcare is also under his purview. Yes. And if I can just do a little history here, it was the Trudeau government, of course, federally, that brought in the so-called $10 a day childcare program, making agreements with every province in the country. Yes. Ontario was one of the last to sign on.
Yes.
And I guess we're now having to decide whether we want to re-up for another year. What's happening on that?
Right. So the government has announced a 1-year extension to their current agreement, which the federal government and the province are funding. The federal government provides a bunch of money. The province agrees to some milestones, but the milestones are not yet at the $10 a day figure that parents were hoping for. Right. The current deal was set to expire at the end of March of next year, of 2026. This extension will keep it in place at least until the end of December of 2026. So that is the good news. The bad news, as I say, we are not at the $10 a day figure yet that I think a lot of parents would be hoping for. Ontario families are paying on average, according to the government, $19 per day. Not clear really when or even if Ontario will get to that $10 a day figure, though the government says it is working towards that target, but we're not there yet, let me put it that way. Now, on the other hand, credit to both the provincial and federal government for this program. As somebody who did have to pay childcare fees once upon a time back before the $10 a day program was in place, families are, even with this $19 a day figure, families are saving something like $10,000 a year. So there's definitely some success there, and even the partial success under the current program, I would say no parent wants to go back to the before times where it was basically, a second mortgage payment.
Well, that's the point I was going to make, actually. I heard from numerous parents, back in the before time about how they were spending as much on childcare as they were on their rent or their mortgage payments. It was high.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As I say, my kid predated their child care years predated the $10 a day program. I kind of want a refund retroactive.
I was going to say, you're going to go get a retroactive? Good luck with that.
Yeah, I'm not optimistic. But yeah, no, it was a tough time, right? But certainly I don't begrudge anybody who's enjoying these savings now.
There we go. Lest we forget, we're off to issue 2. This was Remembrance Week in Ontario, with special observances all over the province on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, marking, of course, the end of the First World War in 1918. JMM, let me just ask you, when that clock strikes 11, who do you think of?
Well, I tend to think about my grandparents. I've mentioned before on the podcast, my grandmother was a Red Cross nurse who served in England during World War II. My grandfather on my father's side, and she met during the war, and they would later return to Canada after the war and start their life here. On my mother's side, my grandfather served in Korea but did not serve in World War II. Those are the people I think about. I think a lot about the bells, right? The ringing of bells. During World War II in England, the bells were silenced for, I think, from 39 to 43. The Parliament said, no, you can't ring bells. We are only going to ring bells if there's an invasion. That's going to be the sign. And as the threat of invasion passed in 43, the churches were allowed to ring bells again. And then, of course, on VE Day, they did nothing but ring church bells all day, I'm quite certain. There's something about the sound of bells ringing that I associate with both wartime and remembrance.
I think of two of my dad's uncles. My dad was 6 years old when the war started, so he obviously did not serve, but he had two uncles, brothers of his mother. I'll say their names, Mo Holliff and Saul Holliff, who wore the uniform and served in World War II. And my mother had an uncle named Murray Sibulash, who also put the uniform on and served in World War II. So I remember them. But in fact, the guy I remember the most and think about the most is Richard Rohmer. And Richard Rohmer has had the pleasant responsibility of speaking on behalf of the troops at the Remembrance Day ceremony at Queen's Park almost every year since the memorial wall was created in front of the legislature. I say almost every year because he was sick for a couple of years and didn't make it. But he's over 100 years old now, and he did it last year, and he was back again this year. And he's been lobbying. He used that opportunity to get in front of the microphone, and besides speak for the troops, he would say, "Premier, I need to have something else engraved on my wall." He calls it my wall. And, up until recently, that spot that he wanted something engraved on has been blank. But it seems like the Premier has been listening to Richard Rohmer, Lieutenant General, and apparently got it done. Let's have a look.
I said, the wall that we do have here now has no name on it. And I would like you, if you would, to paint on it or create on it the name Ontario's Veterans Memorial. He didn't have much difficulty in doing that. He said it would be done. Well, as you go out to the other side of this wall, on your way on to your next adventure, you will see the words in gold, Ontario Veterans Memorial. And that's my wall, the Premier's wall, your wall. All for the veterans of Ontario. And it is a magnificent piece of architecture, and I'm so proud to have had a small part in its existence.
Which he did. You know, he was
Absolutely.
back in the day, it was the McGuinty government that built the wall, and they tasked him with being a part of the organizing committee to make sure that the thing got done. And I'll tell you, Richard Rohmer, I don't care what policy change you want, you should hire him to be your lobbyist. That's a guy who knows how to pull the levers of power and get stuff done. It's a beautiful thing that he's still able to come down to Queen's Park on the 11th of November and make that speech. Lives in the Sunnybrook Veterans Ward now,
Right.
and he's a great man, and I'm so glad he's still able to do that.
You know, it was a really because we mentioned this last year that he in his speech last year he sort of said to the premier, like, hey, let's
go,
let's get this done. And so I was watching the proceedings, and when I saw that somebody had pointed a camera at the wall and the engraving had been done, it was like, oh, we absolutely have to bring this back.
Yeah, he in a way he calls it my wall, in part because of the organizing he done, and in part because, you know, in World War II, General Rohmer flew reconnaissance missions, and his Spitfire plane is engraved on that wall. So if you go down to Queen's Park and you look at the wall, you'll see obviously representations from much of Canada's military history, and he made sure he got his Spitfire plane engraved on that wall.
Yes.
So yeah, in many respects, it is his wall.
Yes, a little bit of personal touch there is nice.
Amen.
Yes.
And with that, we're off to issue 3. Last week, the province of Ontario released its fall economic statement, basically a chance for the government to update us on where the books are at midway through the fiscal year. To help give us a better understanding of that, we welcome public policy economist Brian Lewis, who used to work in the Ontario Ministry of Finance and now teaches at the U of T's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Brian, great to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Now, the first thing we need to do is ask about that shirt. You and I talked last week, and we agreed that we were going to wear our Ticats stuff in the event the Ticats won the CFL Eastern Final, and we're therefore going to the Grey Cup this weekend. Brian, I hate to break the news to you. They didn't win the game, so why are you wearing the Ticat shirt when I thought we agreed we were only going to do this if they won?
Yeah, so first of all, Steve, my apologies for breaking our deal. I just felt I wanted to remain loyal to the team. I'm a big Tiger Cats fan, and while the loss was disappointing, part of sports is being loyal to your team. And this shirt was a gift many years ago from my mother, Carol Lewis, who is, I think, the biggest Hamilton Tiger Cat fan you will find. Bold statement, but I'll stand by it.
I'm going to take that on right now. And I admit, I altered our deal just slightly because, Sheldon, you want to get a shot of this? I am actually wearing my mother's Hamilton Tiger Cat wristwatch.
All right.
So we are both repping our moms here today, which is a beautiful thing. There we go. Shall we talk some finance?
Yes, please.
Okay.
I'm better on economics and finance than I am on football.
I can confirm that. Yes, indeed. Well, let's start from sort of 30,000 feet, Brian, and say on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is sort of fiscal Armageddon, and 10 is we've eliminated the debt, we've eliminated the deficit, all of our social programs are funded. Where is Ontario at right now?
Wow, you're asking a prof to grade something. 5 or 6. We are nowhere near financial Armageddon. Nowhere close. We're not in Canada or in Ontario in a impending sovereign debt crisis where governments are bankrupt and can't meet their obligations. We are nowhere close to that. But we're also in a position where governments are borrowing a lot of money, which has consequences for future generations. There's no apparent plans to repay the debt that we're running up right now.
Does that concern you?
It concerns me a bit because it's going to mean higher interest payments on future generations than we're already seeing. For example, in the province of Ontario, we're paying something like $16 billion in interest payments this year. It's more than we spend on post-secondary education and more than we spend on almost anything. So there's consequences to all this debt. So we're not in crisis, but there is a cost that we're kicking down the road that will probably stay there forever.
The nominal size of the deficit of $13.5 billion this year. Is that number itself meaningful? How much does the size of the deficit concern you?
It doesn't concern me that much. And, the $1 billion improvement in the fall economic statement is good news, but on the margin, it doesn't make a big difference. The government's over $400 billion in debt. So I know $1 billion is a lot of money to you and I, but when you're already $400 billion in debt, it's not adding that much. So it's a bit of good news. It's making something a little bit better. Likewise, the $13 billion deficit that the government's planning towards, that's an obligation that'll be added to that debt, but it's not really a drop in a bucket, but it's also not like a big boulder being dropped into it either. So we're just adding a little bit to what's already a big debt.
I learned a long time ago that you don't necessarily look at the number, as in $13 billion. You look at that number as a percentage of what it represents, as a percentage of the economic pie that we're trying to grow here, I guess.
Yes.
The government says, as a percentage of the economy, the deficit and the debt are actually going down. Are they right about that?
It looked to me in the fall economic statement that there's a federal budget in the Ontario fall economic statement. They're going a bit in different directions, but as a share of the economy, both are reasonably stable. Ontario's is projected to go down a little bit, which is good news. And I'd go a little bit further on that. Let's compare Ontario and Canada to other jurisdictions. We're doing okay, especially when you look at the national picture. Other countries, our peer countries, are in far scarier financial shape than Canada is. And we're also doing far better than we were as a country, at least. The provincial story was different, as Steve would undoubtedly know. But if we go back to the Trudeau the Elder and Mulroney eras, we were far more in debt nationally than we are now. So
As a percentage of the economy.
Yes.
Got it.
So
Right, yeah, I think if we think about the where the beginnings of my political memories start in the mid '90s, right? Substantially more serious economic and fiscal challenges facing both the province and the national economy at the time.
Yep,
but we are in another kind of crisis right now. The relationship with the United States is not what it once was, and it's not the relationship that our policymakers have really, bet the last several decades on, assuming that we would have that American customer there almost, for all time. Given that we are vulnerable to someone of, let's say, questionable rationality right now.
Who might you be referring to there?
Yeah, I'm going to be polite about the president. Everything in the fall economic statement and the budget is based on projections, right? It's based on models, but you can't model Donald Trump. You can't make a projection about Donald Trump. How do you deal with a challenge like that? How do you give useful advice to the government when you've got this unquantifiable variable?
Yeah, and it's not the first time we've seen this, not in my career. We had a global financial crisis, we had a global pandemic, and other circumstances in our past where governments are facing an enormous amount of economic uncertainty, yet need to do forward-looking documents that include economic forecasts. So the approach that the federal and provincial governments are taking, and the sort of time-honored one, is to ask the other people who are looking at forecasts what they see coming, and they will have a range of views. There's 13 forecasters surveyed by the Ontario Ministry of Finance. They have different views about this year, next year, and the years to follow. The practice is to not only follow their numbers, but have conversations with them. What are you seeing in terms of the impact of all this on our economy? What are the mechanisms? What are the risks? And you get a sense not just of numbers, but also a qualitative sense of where all the risks of the economy are. And then for budgetary planning purposes, then it's a useful anchor for the governments to have those external, private sector, mostly driven forecasts. And the practice has been to take an average of them and decide to. The question is, how much below that do you want to be for the sake of prudence?
Can I ask, did you ever have those conversations with the private sector forecasters when you were at the Ministry of Finance? And how does a conversation like that go? Obviously, you can't sort of spill, the beans about, what you did in government necessarily.
Why not? No, spill. Let's go. Let's go.
But yeah, can you give us some sense of is this just like an informal discussion with somebody at Scotiabank or Royal Bank or one of these large financial actors?
Yeah, there are sort of like private. I don't want to call it Chatham House rules kind of conversations. The finance minister meets with all the bank economists to find out their, sort of unedited, professional opinion about where the economy is going, and I would do that as well. In my years working in the finance ministry, we'd engage with them all the time, because we're all dealing with the similar things. And how, having a conversation about how do you see the impact of this on the economy, and your point about the environment we're in is a really important one. Is we don't have like an economic lever that we can push or pull that says, the degree of unfriendliness of the American president sort of parameter that we can feed into the economy. So people end up looking at these things and use a lot of professional judgment. And there's a lot of people around who've been doing this for a long time. So hearing from them how they see this is really important. I still have conversations occasionally with some people in the forecasting community, and one of the interesting questions that I thought was interesting to me anyway is, what are you assuming about U.S. tariffs and related economic uncertainty in the years ahead? And a lot of them are assuming we're going to go through a couple of tough years, but things will get gradually better through 2026, and they're hoping that, or even forecasting that by the time we get to 2027, we're back to kind of a more normal state of the world, which I hope is true.
I wouldn't bet on it.
And that's the challenge for finance ministers. So putting out a forecast that you think is reasonable, from if you're just forecasting the economy, is one thing. But if you're a finance minister who's needing to make decisions in a very uncertain future, you're going to want to be probably more prudent about that. And there's a fundamental dilemma that finance ministers have, and I think that it's being walked very well, is on one hand, you need to be prudent, realistic to prudent about your planning, but you also need to be hopeful. You need to portray strong leadership and a positive sort of message around the economy and what you're doing for it, because that confidence is really important right now when it's been so shaken by what's happening in the United States.
Yeah. I want to ask you about taxes. I think I'm right in saying this, but you will either confirm or deny if I'm wrong. Every government in my lifetime, going all the way back to John Robarts' government in the 1960s, right up until Doug Ford's government of 2018, every government has both raised and lowered taxes depending on the circumstances and what the economy needed, etc. Doug Ford's government has taken particular pride, I think, in saying we've never, ever raised a tax or a fee. Now, if you believe that balancing the budget is in and of itself a good thing to do, and I think most of us in our regular lives think it's important to balance our books, do taxes at some point or fees at some point need to be raised to accomplish that?
It would make it a lot easier, because if you're taking that out of the toolkit, all you have left is raising revenue from other things. So if you're the province, we're going to get more money from the federal government. I don't think that's going to be a priority for the years to come. And then you're not left with much else. They do collect money for a bunch of other things.
Well, you can hopefully sell more booze, or hopefully sell more lottery tickets or cannabis, but hope is not a strategy.
Hope is definitely not a strategy, and those are not nearly as big money winners in the overall scope of the government's budget as you would think. LCBO makes $2 billion a year. Again, a lot of money.
Not this year.
No, not this year.
Down this year.
Normally would make $2 billion. That's a lot of money to you or I. Mm-hmm. Government's revenues are $220 billion, so it's a small part. I think it's going to be really hard for governments to get us back on good financial shape without doing something on taxes, because if you're not going to do something on taxes, you're pretty much eliminating from your toolbox doing anything on revenues.
So you got to cut spending.
Then you have to be cutting spending, and if you look at the province's fall economic statement fiscal plan, what they are planning on in terms of expenditure projections amount to cuts. Like, the expense numbers in the fall economic statement are a lot lower than we would expect, just given on where we expect the population and the economy to go, which means saving money somehow. Steve, you used the word cuts. That's probably the way to think about it. The government will probably be thinking about it more in terms of efficiencies and productivity and improvement. Those are good things for governments to do. Squaring up this big gap in healthcare spending, which the Financial Accountability Office puts at $9 billion, it's going to be pretty hard to do with those sorts of things. You should still try, but it's hard to believe that's going to close this kind of gap in expenditures we're going to need versus expenditures that are in the fiscal plan.
So I'm just confirming, you think Doug Ford needs to raise taxes if he wants to balance the books by the end of this term?
He might also just continue to get lucky on revenue forecasts. The revenues have tended to come in significantly higher than what the government expects in the budgets. Partly that's prudence, partly it's been good luck. Revenues have been rising faster than we would normally expect given economic performance. If that good luck's continue, maybe he won't need to. I don't think he's not betting on luck in the fall economic statement, which is good, but they are betting on a lot of expenditure constraint, which I think is going to be challenging. And I think I'd like to hear more about how you're going to accomplish that, because right now it's hard to see how this adds up.
Both the feds and the province have made a priority to help diversify our trade away from this single-minded focus on the Americans as our customer of first and last resort. But this is hard, right? Like just the geography of Ontario, I've previously described Southern Ontario sort of like it's an arrow pointed directly at Michigan, right? How realistic is it to actually diversify national, but particularly Ontario's trade away from reliance on the Americans?
It's really hard to do. That's exactly right, John. We're really far from all these places. So trade in goods, we're obviously going to be oriented towards the United States. That just makes enormous geographic and economic sense. We have had some success diversifying our trade. To some degree, that's been good luck. Like our exports to the UK have gone up over time. Turns out that's because gold prices have gone up, and that's one of the things we ship to the UK. But the opportunity is there. Other countries, especially developing economies, have more opportunity for us to export to. But you are right; it is hard. And there's an ambitious goal set out by the Prime Minister for the country. It's probably relatively harder for Ontario than almost any other part of the country because we're in the middle of the country, and we're also probably exporting less of the goods that are likely to sell in the rest of the world, like energy-related things. Now, that said, there are opportunities there. If the Ring of Fire became a big mining development, we could be exporting a lot of that stuff to around the world, and it doesn't have to be the United States. But I think it's the right things for governments to focus on, but they would all admit that this is hard to do. You're absolutely right about that.
Let me circle back to something you said earlier. I want you to name names on which countries are doing way worse than us, because it feels here like we're in deep. Who's worse than us?
Financially?
Yeah.
The United States, by far, their debt and deficit is way, way, way bigger than Canada's, however you look at it. Also the UK, significantly worse financially right now than Canada. And as you go throughout all the G7 countries, we're actually doing the best. So we're not doing great, but we're doing relatively well. So that we should take some comfort with, because to some degree, when you're out there borrowing money to finance your debt, looking relatively better is what matters. If everybody's in trouble, being the least in trouble actually helps you continue to borrow. So you're actually not doing that bad. But we should still not lose sight of the fact that this is not free. Even if we're doing relatively better than these other countries, we are still kicking a cost down the road of interest payments that will probably last forever.
I suppose we should finish up on the catch-all question, which is, anything we haven't asked that you want to add?
Wow. I thought you were going to ask me about what happened to the economy during the Jays playoff run, Steve.
That's okay.
Which was good. We had a really good jobs month, all in jobs probably related to the Blue Jays run.
It was good for Rogers, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
It was good for a lot of us. It was very
Hot
uplifting.
dog and beer sales.
But on the more serious side, I think it's good to see governments taking strong leadership, and we all can have our own personal views about whether they've got the right policies or not. But the important thing is they recognize the problem, they're showing confidence, they're taking action. That is all really good. There are things I would do differently. There are probably things you both would do differently than what our governments are doing, but let's give them some credit for trying to take some strong leadership and help us through it. It's going to be potentially a really challenging economic and financial time.
You got that right. Brian Lewis, even with the Ticats jersey on, good of you to join us this week on the onpoli podcast. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
It was great to be here. Thank you.
And now we're off to your column, my column. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I have a little chat about the stuff we wrote for tvo.org over the past week. Start us off.
Right. So we've already had some Hamilton discussion. So I'm unfortunately not the first to check this box. But one of the things I wrote for the website this week does involve the city of Hamilton. It is a bit of a sad story. It involves a cyclist who was badly injured biking in the south end of Hamilton. And sued the city for what he alleged was negligence in terms of maintaining a right-of-way. This has already been heard at trial, and this week the Court of Appeal made its views known, issued a decision reversing the lower court's decision, and it's relevant because, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about the rights of cyclists to safely use the road in Ontario right now. And in this case, the Court of Appeal reversed the decision of the lower court, which had said that this gentleman unfortunately had no right to sue the city. Ontario law basically says that if you are on the untraveled part of the road, you are sort of taking your own chances. The city is not required to maintain a safe passage. And you can sort of see why this makes sense, right? Obviously, a car driving on the designated part of the road, the city has some responsibility to maintain that road in good condition. But if I take my car off of the road, what responsibility does the city have for me doing something that they don't want me doing, right? And so that is the question that the court has had to decide. The lower court decided one way. The Court of Appeal has now reversed that. And they said in part in their decision that it was notable and it was important to understand that these cyclists had not taken this off-road path that they were on when one of them was injured. They had not done that purely for fun, purely for frivolous reasons. They had done so because they did not believe that they were safe on the on-street bike lane, which was just frankly a bit of paint and a paved shoulder. This decision comes, of course, as we are expecting earlier next year in January, the Court of Appeal will hear arguments about the fate of the Cycle Toronto case, where, of course, a lower court found that the government's plan to remove bike lanes in Toronto infringed the charter rights of cyclists. This case is not directly comparable. I want to be careful about how we present this, because this Hamilton case is purely about municipal liability. That most exciting of all topics, but I do think it's important to keep in mind. When the court says cyclists don't get to make perfect decisions about safe versus unsafe. In the real world, they have to balance their risks, and the governments cannot necessarily assume that they are going to obey every perfectly signed roadway, that kind of thing. It's a very complicated case, and the court has so far just sent it back for a rehearing. We will see again how that proceeds, but it could end up being relevant for what the court decides next year regarding bike lanes in Toronto.
Another one of these. Stay tuned.
Absolutely, so many of those lately.
Well, I have this sort of abnormal fascination with the most exclusive club in Ontario history.
Yes.
As evidenced by the different wardrobe I wear every week, which tends to be a picture of a former premier on a T-shirt. For whatever reason, I have always been fascinated by the 26 people, and let me be more specific, the 25 men and one woman who have become premiers of Ontario since 1867, since Confederation. And there are 6 that are still alive, 6 former premiers of Ontario. They go back 40 years to 1985. David Peterson, Bob Rae, Mike Harris, Ernie Eves, Dalton McGuinty, Kathleen Wynne. Yeah. They are the 6 living ex-premiers. They all have very different backgrounds. Bob Rae, for example, was the son of an ambassador. Yeah. He always used to joke about how he grew up in a log embassy. He spent some of his childhood living in Washington, D.C. He was then Vice President Richard Nixon's paperboy, if you can imagine. Mike Harris's father, conversely, operated a ski hill in North Bay, Ontario. Pretty different backgrounds. David Peterson and Dalton McGuinty both had fathers who ran for office, ran for provincial parliament. Mr. McGuinty's father actually won in Ottawa South. David Peterson's father ran against John Robarts and did not win. Ernie Eves' father worked on an auto parts plant assembly line in Windsor, Ontario. Kathleen Wynne's dad was a doctor. They come from various and disparate backgrounds. But they all, at least the 6 who are still around, they have all had a chance to sort of climb to the highest mountain in provincial politics in this province. And as a result, over the past year, I have been doing interviews with these 6, and they have now all aired on television, on TVO, and they are now archived in something we're calling the Premier Files, which are, just Google my name and the Premier Files, and you know the site will come up. And all 6 of the interviews are now archived there forever, which I think will be a wonderful resource for people who want to find out more about how these people got to where they got to, the decisions they made, and what decisions they would revisit if they had that opportunity all these years later. I think the thing, and my column actually posits this question, the thing that really stays with me after having done all the interviews now, when we start the interviews, John Michael, they are so happy and enthusiastic, and they can't wait to tell me about all the plans that they had and the stuff they enacted and how much fun the job was. And then, of course, David Peterson has this great expression about how the longer you stay in office, the more barnacles affix themselves to the ship of state.
Yeah.
And without exception, all 6 of them, by the time I got to the end of the interview, it's like they were just like the wind had gone out of their sails.
It relived the trauma.
Truly. Yeah. And, you know, because all of them, all 6 left office much less popular than when they went in. Yeah. They didn't all lose elections. Mike Harris walked away without having lost an election, but he would have lost had he stuck around. So they all know that old Wide World of Sports line. They know the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat.
Yeah.
And anyway, I think now that the interviews are all archived, if you missed them on television, they're all available to watch. The Premier Files, and enjoy is what I'd say.
There is a life cycle to politics, and I haven't been doing this, frankly, long enough to see multiple iterations of it. But it was one of the things that struck me about covering Kathleen Wynne's government, realizing that just by the nature of the longevity of that Liberal tenure, right, 15 years in power, by the time Kathleen Wynne became premier, the problems she had to solve were, in some cases, in many cases, I would argue, problems that had been caused by solutions the Liberals had brought in after they got elected in 2003, right? If you spend long enough in government, you get called on to solve the problems you yourself created, and that is just the nature of government, right? And the frankly, maybe the unappetizing thought for the current government is check your watch, but we're coming up on about that time, right? This is when these things start to add up, and those barnacles start to affix themselves to the hull, and I think Doug Ford has had not exclusively good luck. He had to govern during a global pandemic, but he's had a relatively fortunate string of elections, certainly. I think if I were a conservative at the moment, I would be sort of looking over my shoulder, because you start to arrive at this point where it's going to get harder than it has been.
There's a time span for every government, for every party in power. Now, there are very, very few exceptions to this rule. I think if you're lucky, you get a guy like Bill Davis, who was in for 14 years and left office as popular as when he came in. Yeah. That is exceedingly rare. Yeah. Usually they are really, don't let the door hit you on the ass on the way out, please, by the time they get to the end of their time. But anyway, the Premier File's there for your edification. Now, we're going to do some mail. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love it when you send us a note at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, fire away.
Right. So we are modifying our policy slightly about mail, in that we are allowing this to come from an anonymous listener, because it is a question about conservation authorities from somebody who works at a conservation authority. So we are going to respect their anonymity. It was quite a lengthy email, so we are going to just edit it down slightly. The email reads, "In the name of education, would you mind nerding out on my behalf and define the term watershed-based and explain why municipal boundaries do not apply to conservation authorities and why proposed regional boundaries could easily slow down the process, especially for us very lucky, low-drama, high-efficiency conservation areas?"
Okay, I'm not touching this one. This one's all yours. Go for it, buddy.
Okay, so we are going to start from the very basics of conservation authorities. Ontario has these conservation authorities, and they are kind of like environmental protection agencies intended to protect rivers and floodplains, mostly but not exclusively in southern Ontario, and that's going to be important. We're going to get back to that. They were created in 1946, or at least the first ones were created in 1946, but then they had their powers substantially expanded after Hurricane Hazel in 1954. Of course, Hurricane Hazel did a lot of damage in the GTA, what we would now call the GTA, but people's homes were flooded and in some cases washed away entirely.
People got killed.
Exactly. And so the conservation authorities were given the power to regulate where and how people could build. In general, you cannot build on lands protected by conservation authorities, or if you do build there, it's only with very, very strict rules. So that means that, like, who are the other agencies, if you will, that regulate building in Ontario? They're municipalities. Municipalities and conservation authorities have to work together a lot of the time to iron out things like building permissions, development controls, that kind of thing. Now, a few weeks ago, the government announced it was consolidating the conservation authorities into a handful of larger bodies. So I believe from more than 30 to about 9. And they would also create an overarching body called the Ontario Provincial Conservation Agency, which would oversee the conservation authorities themselves. Now, to get to our correspondence question, the government says its intention is to maintain the principle of basing the boundaries of conservation authorities on watersheds. Folks who do not remember their high school geography, a watershed is basically just the area that drains into a river or another body of water. So you and I, sitting here at Yonge and Eglinton in Toronto, are in the Don Valley River watershed. Snow and rain that falls on this building or on the street outside will eventually drain into the Don River, from there into Lake Ontario, the St. Lawrence, the Atlantic Ocean.
You know, while you were talking, I just looked it up. 81 killed in Toronto, Hurricane Hazel. Wow. 81 people.
Yeah.
It was massive.
And it explains why the response was to create these pretty substantially powerful agencies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So they're going to change the boundaries. How are they going to figure all that out?
So the boundaries are supposed to conform to the boundaries of existing watersheds, and all of the watersheds in Ontario are very thoroughly mapped out. This is an important thing to know, like, where does the water go? But the new consolidated authorities are still supposed to be mapped out to the watersheds, just on a larger scale. So instead of having one conservation authority for the upper Thames River and a different one for the lower Thames River, you would consolidate some of those conservation authorities into much larger agencies. Now, there are a few exceptions, at least in the map that the government has provided for the public consultation process. And it's important to say that we are still just in the public consultation process of this. The government has not formally implemented any of these decisions yet. So as I mentioned, most conservation authorities are in southern Ontario, but there are a handful in the north. And the government, again, the map that the government provided in the public consultation process would have the same conservation authority regulate both Thunder Bay and a huge swath of central Ontario, from like Grand Bend and Goderich on the shores of Lake Huron all the way to Orillia.
It's not abundantly obvious to me that those two locations have much in common, but okay.
Yeah, well, and so I think about, if you remember during the COVID pandemic, particularly in Northern Ontario, some of those public health units are just so enormous that the government would say, okay, well, the rules for the public health unit in Thunder Bay are this, and the bars can open, but you remember that whole thing about how those rules would change. But what it also meant, because those PHUs were so large, was that like towns that were 200 miles away were suddenly being subjected to rules designed to control an outbreak in Thunder Bay. A similar concern raises itself in my brain with this. I understand that the government wants to, consolidate things, make things more streamlined, more efficient. I suspect that people in Thunder Bay are going to have some questions about whether they can really effectively be governed by a body that, just the sheer workload in southern Ontario would, to me, always mean that questions about what's happening in Thunder Bay are always going to get backburnered despite good intentions.
Right. And you want to give the email address and get out of here?
Right. Again, if you would like to ask about content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, November 14th, 2025.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Please write us at onpolitics@tvo.org and be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced by Matthew O'Mara, editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Laura Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
We always like to thank the crew for fixing up the space here on the 5th floor of 2180 Yonge Street and the folks 5 floors below us in the control room who are following their fearless leader, Sheldon the Great Osmondo. Thanks, guys, so much for everything. And until next time, bye-bye.
Bye. Hi there, my name is John Michael McGrath, and I'm a podcast host and writer here at TVO. I focus on provincial politics, explaining to our audience what is happening at Queen's Park, from education policy and healthcare to transit and housing and, yes, even bike lanes. Here at TVO, we believe that democracy requires an educated, engaged citizen, and one way we help build that is by supporting quality journalism. Your donations help make that possible, and we're grateful.